Hello and welcome to Lore Watch, roundtable freeform discussion about lore and our favorite media. I'm your host, Joe Perez, one of several lore-focused folks from Blizzard Watch, and I've got my excitable co-host with me today, Matt Rossi. How you doing today, Matt?
I'm fine. How are
See,
you?
I knew if I did that, you would immediately try to change course.
Of course I would. If I am nothing if not completely predictable in how unpredictable I am.
That's fair. That's true. So we normally would be answering your questions from our wonderful listeners. And if you do have questions or suggestions for the podcast, you can go ahead and send those into podcast@blizzardwatch.com, specify the show that it is for, and then go ahead and give us any special pronunciations for your name.
However, sorry, I just need to point out, Helen, don't get back in touch with him. It's for your own good. You don't need that in your life. I just figured we could answer her question.
Fair. All right. Well, and then if you don't want to send us an email and you want to hit us up on Discord, we have a couple channels set aside for you. One is our Q and Podcast Questions channel. It's open to everybody. Feel free to join and, well, send us your suggestions and questions and what show it's for and all the special pronunciations for your name there as well. And if you are a Patreon subscriber, as a way of saying thank you for helping us keep the lights on, because it is rather important, you can go ahead and hit us up on the Patreon Q and Podcast channel. Same rules apply, but we always tend to look there first. Well, today we're not really doing that. Instead, we're going to be talking about Xal'atath. Why? Well, one, because I'm pretty sure Mitch has been waiting for this episode for years. And two, it seems rather relevant with the War Within coming up and Xal'atath being, well, pretty front and center, I would say. She's on all the marketing campaign stuff, and everything seems to be tied up with her, at least at first. So I guess, Matt, Xal'atath's a hard one to start with, right? Because our introduction to Xal'atath was in Legion as the Shadow Priest weapon. And before that, we hadn't seen anything of that nature, right? The closest we saw was Xal'atath, which was the desecrated image of Gorehowl, which is a completely separate entity. So this sort of came out of nowhere, right? There was no pre-existing anything for it.
Well, I mean, depends on how you look at it, because prospectively speaking, there were things that they've then since tied into Xal'atath that go back quite a bit. But yeah, Xal'atath was created for Legion. This is one of the difficult things about a long-form story. Sometimes people introduce something that had never been mentioned before, but they use elements that had been mentioned before in the story for it. So in order to talk about it, you have to talk about all this stuff from the story that's older than the expansion that it happened in. So it's usually easier, in my opinion, it's easier to talk about it as if you don't know anything about the real world. Like, you don't know what expansion it came in. Yeah. None of that. You're looking at it from the perspective of the story as it's being told. From the story as it's being told, Xal'atath dates back to the Black Empire. In Legion, we experience repeatedly, if you're a Shadow Priest, you experience Xal'atath's perspective on things. And it's an interesting one from the get-go. One of the things that you learn from Xal'atath is that it is extremely arch. I don't know how else to put it. It's like if the old gods were on an episode of Gossip Girl. Yeah. In terms of like how Xal'atath talks about them and thinks about them. One thing I thought was really interesting, and we should talk about this first up, I think, is the quote-unquote rumors about Xal'atath's origin.
Well, I mean, I guess upon that, maybe we should start and see if you agree with what we know from when it was first introduced from the Legion artifact book.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, all right, we don't know the first person to use Xal'atath. We don't know, like, we know that it apparently dates back to the Black Empire, but we don't know the first person to use it. I can never remember. I'm pretty sure it's hinted that it's used in the Gurubashi Empire.
100%. So, yeah.
And then there's basically, when you're a Shadow Priest and you're coming upon the quest to get Xal'atath, it starts with Natalie Celine, who is a former Stormwind priest who was investigating rumors of a weapon that was being wielded by, dark magicians against Stormwind. It was like she was an orc hunter, like back when during the First and Second Wars, like she had a lot of stuff going on there. And she heard about this weapon that this one, now I want to say a necrolite had called, Xal'atath, and she eventually she found it herself and began using it to learn more about shadows and shadow magic. Essentially, Xal'atath is the reason that the Shadow Priest tradition exists as it does on Azeroth. And Natalie Selene's was the one who codified the way it is. When you see a Shadow Priest throughout World of Warcraft, usually it's based on those traditions. While she was studying it and reading the book that came with it, I can't remember the name of that book. Do you remember the name of it?
I'm not remembering off the top of my head.
Yeah,
Sally Forth.
Yeah, but she was studying that book and studying Xal'atath, and meanwhile, her followers were jealous because she was gaining all this knowledge and insight into the void and into shadow magic, and so they killed her so they could take the knife for themselves, but they couldn't because after they got done killing her, the knife was gone. They couldn't find it, and that led to basically, when you're a Shadow Priest going through the thing, you finally figure out, the knife chooses its wielder. It's not the other way around. It's not up to you whether you get to use it. It's up to the knife. So you go ahead, you deal with the people who've been trying to find it and use it ever since, because as Xal'atath herself derisively points out, they think that they can make her obey them. And that's not how this works. That's not the deal. So your player character, if you're a Shadow Priest, gets a hold of Xal'atath, and you go from there into Legion, where throughout Legion we've got an old god problem. I mean, the Burning Legion is the front and center threat. The back threat is definitely the old gods, and it's really kind of amusing to see Xal'atath's opinions on the stuff that they're seeing. Like, Xal'atath holds the Legion in total disdain. Like, doesn't not respect, just straight up these guys are amateurs. Anybody can
doesn't
burn
see
something
them as
down
a threat.
Yeah. I mean, they're a threat in that they need to be stopped or they'll destroy the entire world, which is, Xal'atath's where Xal'atath keeps all her stuff. But she definitely doesn't have any kind of, I'm going to say she because it feels weird, and I know that eventually takes a female form.
The personification chosen, which was chosen by Xal'atath, is that of a female elf.
So she will, reveals as you're going through Legion, you go to various places that are very old. Obviously, you're on the Broken Isles. Some of this place goes back to the demon invasion, and so Xal'atath has opinions on these things and says things. Also, very, very disdainful towards the Titans in a way that I think you'll see it again. Let me put it that way. Other people have a similar opinion of the Titans and the Titan Forged as Xal'atath. Xal'atath's like, these jokers, but what's really interesting is her disdain for the other old gods. She doesn't. I don't recall her ever actually commenting about Y'Shaarj.
So there's a lot of speculation, and we can talk about that in a minute. But like what you're saying and how they got there, I want to sort of frame a couple other things too that sort of exert how Xal'atath, even though being presented as a shadow weapon, Matt's kind of glossing over how active and powerful. Oh yeah,
I didn't go through the backstory of it yet. So if you want to go back to some of those elements,
I think I want to pull some of them up because I think it's interesting. Because like when we're talking about the Troll Empire and the Troll Mystics, Xal'atath found its way to Xandoe and a handful of witch doctors that wanted to find this strange mound of blackened stone that they were sort of compelled to go there.
Oh, right. Kithix, I'm sorry. I forgot. That's my bad. That's my bad, guys.
That's okay. But I think this is kind of important because what was here was a great power, or so he was told, to defeat his rivals. It happened to be a servant of the old god named Kithix who was sleeping after being beaten to a pulp many eons ago and being locked away into this, like, what is essentially... It was a mountain, but it was kind of a burial site.
Okay, just because now I have to do it to you. I'm going to try to do this real fast. Kithix was one of the two Chithraxi overlords sent by Loken, who was a thrall of the old god Yogg-Saron, to kill Tyr. And Tyr beat Kithix so badly that he had to run away, and then managed to kill the other one, Jazax. I never pronounce that
Jazz
name.
Hands.
Yeah, he managed to kill that guy, but he died himself. And as a result of all this, Kithix basically walked halfway down the continent and then finally collapsed.
Yep.
So That's who Kithix was. Now continue with the Troll War.
Absolutely. So Xal'atath urged the blood sacrifices to this creature, and with being completely in its thrall, Xando did. Eventually, Kithix wound up rumbling to life and basically started this massive shadow war upon Azeroth. The monstrous creature itself rallied other old god minions to its side and launched a campaign to grind troll civilization into dust, or as Matt calls it, rather appropriately, Troll Wars.
Yeah, this is the war that basically ended the Zandalari Empire on Azeroth.
Now, I was going to say, the interesting thing, though, is during the description of this, and again, unreliable narrator is got to be something that we keep in mind here, because we're writing this fourth hand at best, that Kithix knew how to harness Xal'atath's potential, which is where we sort of get the understanding that maybe this was part of an old god, or maybe had something to do with a direct link to the old god pantheon, because that power was old god power that was being unleashed by the Kithraxi here.
Yeah, and it's also good to notice, Joe mentioned Xal'atath earlier, the Dust created the image of Gorhel. Xal'atath was a weapon created directly by Yogg-Saron.
Yes.
No, I'm sorry, not Yogg-Saron. Yashraj.
Yashraj.
Or the heart
Yashraj.
of Yashraj. And Yashraj is dead, but Yashraj's heart and the seven Shah born out of his killing were still present, and it's that power is what created Xal'atath. So we know that since Xal'atath and Xal'atath share kind of a prefixual basis, there's at least some evidence that an old god made Xal'atath. And since it's the same name, basically with one letter off, it might be the same old god.
That's the thought, because the old gods did have sort of their own like minion structure that seemed to be a thing. Even with their Kithraxi minions, and their naming seemed to all be like in families or groupings. Don't quote me on that, but it seems that at first glance
there's at least a little evidence for it.
Yeah. Now the other thing is, after this war, after the Troll War happened, and after the trolls eventually destroy Kithrax and defeat the armies, Xal'atath basically, that memory haunts all those survivors, and is actually, the Black Blade is a legend told among the trolls, because it almost killed all of troll life. It almost destroyed troll civilization in this war.
I mean, it did basically break the Zandalari power and created the Gurubashi and Amani trolls that we know of. The large empires that they founded were founded by them basically it was a way for the Zandalari to get them out of Zandalari territories, because they realized we're too weak to fight them. If they decide they want to take over, they're going to do it. Yep. So they basically tricked them into going forth to find other old god and old god minions. The war is often called the Akir War as well, because they were fighting the Akir, who are the ancestors to the Silithid and the Nerubians and the Silithid. And it was basically by scattering the Amani and Gurubashi and putting them in places where they knew other old god influences were, they could kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. They could keep the Gurubashi and Amani from fighting each other and one of them winning and then being the unquestioned master of everything. And they could keep the Akir and their descendants somewhat contained, because they would be fighting the Amani and the Gurubashi and not them. And if you go to the place, the desert in Zandalar, where the Fox people are from.
Yeah.
If you go there, you can literally see the original homes of the Amani and Gurubashi. Like they used to live in that desert, and that desert was destroyed.
One of the runes you go to is basically one of their own like rune temples.
Yeah, it's like Al-Malaman, I think.
Yeah.
But when you go there, that desert was created by this war. That desert is literally the remains of what happened when the old god servant got loose. So that's something to consider when you go into the Black Blade. It had ridiculous influence over the events of Azeroth. Another time, should we talk about Modgood?
I was literally going to say we should talk about Modgood, because that's the next bit. So go ahead.
This is really kind of complicated. I'm sorry, guys.
We'll start by Modgood. If it's a name that you haven't heard, was the wife of Sorcerer Thane Theresian of the Dark Irons.
And she was even more militant about the conquest of the other two other two dwarf, tribes, I guess we'll use the word, but the Bronzebeards and the Wildhammers. She hated them. She wanted them subjugated. She was angry at them because of one thing. Before the rise of the Bronzebeards, the trolls were not. They were ruled by the Anvilmars.
The dwarves.
Yeah, the dwarves. Sorry, I keep saying trolls. My bad. The dwarves were ruled by the Anvilmars. And the Anvilmar line still exists in one person. There's one Anvilmar left. But after the death of the High King Anvilmar, his son wasn't considered by the other I keep trying to say troll, the other dwarf clans as worth following. Now, he wasn't a bad person or anything, but they were like, nah, he's kind of not really, he's not High King material. And essentially the Bronzebeards, who were related to the Anvilmars, basically said, look, we'll give you a permanent Senate seat and we'll honor your family's legacy, but we're taking over. And the Wildhammers were like, F you are, and they took off. They're like, you want to be in charge of this dung heap, go for it. We're going to go where we can fly griffins and be happy. So they left. It wasn't a great breakup, but they weren't really hostile. But the Dark Irons were like seething because they wanted it when Anvilmar didn't take the throne. They were like, why shouldn't we rule? Why should you rule? And so after some uncomfortableness, they took off to build their own place too. Both the Wildhammers and the Dark Irons built massive structures.
Mm-hmm. To rival Ironforge.
Yeah, rival or even exceed. Although Ironforge does have another whole section we never get to see. But regardless, yeah, this is how this setup was. Modgood was furious at the Bronzebeards for doing this. And she was even more furious at the Dark Irons for not having done something about it. In that state, the Black Blade found her and said, look, you like power. I happen to be power. You want vengeance, and I'm totally down with that. Sure. Yeah, let's kill them all. I don't care. And so Modgood got her husband, who was, again, not very far behind her on the whole occultism and madness and doing evil things, section. He had a book. We'll talk about that at some point. Yeah, I've talked about it. So they come up with a plan where he, Thorison, is going to go attack the Bronzebeards, while she and the Dark Irons attack the Wildhammer. And this plan comes within like a hair's breadth of working. Mm-hmm. The Dark Iron army under Thorison lays siege to Ironforge. Go ahead.
I was going to say, don't forget the other thing that's present here is not just dwarves and wizards and priests that they have, because the Dark Iron were really like the magic core of the dwarves. Mm-hmm. They were the ones that understood like sort of the arcane mysteries of the world, runic magic and stuff like that was very primarily them. They had war golems, and they had a lot of war golems. Oh yeah,
then you still see them when you go to Blackrock Descent. You can see that they're the ones they're using.
You can see the factory. You literally go through the factory that is making them, hewn from stone and given life by lava, and it is intense. Sorry, yeah. just wanted to put like the scale that they brought to bear on the other clans.
When the Dark Irons were like the least numerous clan, but the armies they brought forth were massive. And again, hair's breadth of winning. In fact, they would have won if not for the following events. Modgood attacks Grim Batal, which was the home of the Wildhammers at that time, and she straight up takes it. Like the Wildhammers are pushed out. When the Wildhammers are regrouping, they're like, we can't allow this to stand. Their king, and I always forget his name. I'm sorry, guys. Cardros Wildhammer decides on a suicide tactic. He's like, you know what? We cannot leave this place like this. We cannot leave our home in their hands. And so he basically leads a charge, and he goes right for Modgood. He's not trying to win this battle. He's not attempting for victory. He's just trying to kill her because he knows he's seeing what she is doing. She's calling up this power that he's never seen before. She's corrupting the dead. She's bringing forth these tentacled abominations.
She's corrupting Grim Batal.
Yes. So he's like, F it, I'm the Thane. If it costs my life, fine, but I will not allow this to happen. And he goes right for her, and at a pivotal moment where she's like, and now I will turn you into ash, and she holds forth the dagger isn't there.
Yeah, the assumption that she makes is that she must have lost the dagger, but the supposition that we come to now is that, well, she had served her purpose.
Yeah, she's gotten Grim Batal corrupted.
She had given another locus of power to the shadow, to the void, and you see it years later.
It's still there. Yeah.
When you go to Grim Batal, when the minions are all doing their dragon stuff, and you have like making your way through there, just look around. You can see the devastation. But what's the last boss there?
Yeah, he's an Iraqi, a tentacle one.
A faceless one, or faceless. Yeah. So it's
they are called an Iraqi, but yeah.
Yeah, but I mean,
he's a big tentacle monster, man.
A big tentacle monster.
Yeah, you show up and there's a big tentacle monster corrupting eggs. You know what the score is. We've seen this before. And keep in mind, of course, that they were this was during Deathwing's attack on Azeroth, and Deathwing was a servant of the old gods. So now, it's go ahead.
The other interesting is it is recorded and shown here that, at least in the artifact book that you get in your order hall, is that as Modgood laid dying, she just kept repeating over and over and over again, "You promised, you promised, you promised." Yeah. And it should be noted that when she first received the blade, she sequestered herself for an indeterminable amount of time, getting to study the blade, and oftentimes being seen talking directly to it. Our first real glimpse that there was not just a whispers of an intelligence there, but a full intelligence capable of understanding and being cognizant of the world around it.
And in fact, we should briefly mention something, and we won't go into too much detail because we have so much more to talk about, but I want to point out that this wasn't the events that the blade caused with Modgood and Grim Batal aren't limited to Grim Batal, because the entire Burning Steppes is because of her.
Yep.
The blade caused this war. When after the Wildhammers managed to kill Modgood, her forces mostly collapsed, and the few Dark Irons that were left ran away. And the Wildhammers were like, "Well, our home is utterly unlivable. We can't stay here. But before we go and find a new place to live, I think we need to have a talk with Thaurissan." And so the Wildhammers begin marching. They come upon the Bronzebeards, who had just, with the fall of Modgood, Thaurissan had felt her death and had retreated because he was like, "Oh no, I can't. They're going to come, and I can't face both armies at once, especially having lost her shadow power." So he begins retreating. The Wildhammers and the Bronzebeards have a tense confrontation, but is it Kadros or Kurdros?
Kurdros.
Yeah, Kurdros and the Bronzebeard at the time, whose name I don't remember. I'm sorry, guys. But they get together and they're like, "Look, we don't really like each other, but come on, those guys are way worse." And they're like, "Yeah, you know what? You're right. You're a beep, but those guys, oh yeah." And so they march on down to basically say hello with axes and hammers, the dwarven hello. But Thaurissan doesn't really fancy the conversation that he's about to have with those guys. Plus his wife's dead, and he, for all that he was an evil guy, he did love his wife. I mean, you can love your wife and be an evil man. I'm sorry. In case you thought loving your wife meant you wouldn't be. I'm just saying, if you're doing evil things, you're evil. They come to get him, essentially. They're marching down into what is now the Burning Steppes, and he has a book, and that book has a spell in it that tells him he can call a very powerful servant to lay waste to his enemies. So he uses the book, and he does call an extremely powerful servant, so powerful, in fact, that there's absolutely no way he can make that thing a servant, because he calls Ragnaros the Fire Lord to Azeroth. This is the birth of Molten Core. This is the birth of the Blasted Lands. This is the reason that there's a destroyed, wasteland of deserty, nothingness, right in the smack middle of the Eastern Kingdoms, between the human and dwarf kingdoms. And the dwarf armies see this happen and are like, "You think they survived that?" And how did you survive that? And it turns out the answer is, you survived that because Ragnaros wants some slaves. So the Dark Iron dwarves become servants of elementals who are themselves servants of old gods because of Xal'atath. That is Xal'atath's doing. It's not directly her doing, but it's her doing. So think on that when you think about every time Xal'atath has appeared in history. One time she appeared, destroyed a mighty troll empire, split the world apart, and laid the groundwork for the Night Elf Rise. The next time she does it, she creates a blast, and we have no idea how many other times she's arisen in history. We don't know all the times Xal'atath has been used.
But here's an interesting thing to also think about too, and this is something that is, before we start to get into like how we see Xal'atath in game after the emergence, because there's stuff that happens there. There's a whole series of whispers that Xal'atath gives the players when you're going through everything, whether it's in the Order Hall, whether it is in various dungeons, in raids, in zones. She has something to say about everything. And the interesting thing to me is that there are things that happen, or she will whisper to you, even if you are not in shadow spec, even if you do not have the weapon equipped, even if you don't have the weapon on you, it will whisper. She will whisper to you. And I find that very, very fascinating because she has a very broad knowledge of what's happening around and has a very, very long control, right? Like, I remember Halls of Valor. She has something to say about Xal'atath, or Odin. Literally, I think the quote is like, Odin was a great enemy until his own arrogance proved his undoing. Like, she knows everything that's happening around her, even when she's just in the blade. She's powerful. Like, it is a powerful entity.
Yeah, not just powerful, though. Although I think the power is actually second to the other thing.
Manipulative?
It's not that... No. Not that she is also very manipulative, and that's a problem too. But no, the thing about Xal'atath that's really dangerous is that Xal'atath is patient.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean patient even for something that's on the scale of an old god in terms of time. Xal'atath doesn't act unless there's a very good reason for it to do so. Now, the good reason for it, not a good reason for us, but nevertheless, Xal'atath is extremely patient because look at the amount of time between moves. Like, even if we assume, okay, there's also lots of stuff we don't know. Xal'atath will take thousands of years to make a single move and then let things play out and then make another move, which is not, the old gods don't have this level of patience. They're certainly patient compared to mortals, but think about how Yogg-Saron acts when we're dealing with him up in Northrend. Yogg-Saron spends an awful lot of time driving people insane for no particular reason. It isn't doing anything with them to free itself. It's the only time, in fact, it's barely even bound. When you go up to Ulduar, Yogg-Saron's basically free.
Yeah, I mean, well, you even before you go to Ulduar, like you see that Yoggles is basically influencing everything around Northrend already. Serenites everywhere. The tendrils of Yogg-Saron have already started breaching the rest of the continent.
It's turning a reborn world tree to its purposes. Mm-hmm. I mean, and
still there, by the way. There's still a nascent world tree in a pool of Serenite.
And that's the thing about Yogg-Saron or Cthulhu or whatever. It's almost like Xal'atath is sane, and that's weird for an old god servitor thing. And I think it's interestingly dangerous because Xal'atath is sane only in terms of has what seem to be comprehensible goals, and therefore go ahead.
I think and you raise an interesting point. This is something I've thought about a lot because old gods seem to have the Gron effect, and what I mean, or the Titan effect, and what I mean by that is the smaller they go, right, the more that things evolve from them, the more intricate they get. So think about it. The old gods are a step away from a cosmic void lord entity, right? They were flung here into this reality, possibly against their will, we don't know. And so their perspective is different. The next largest thing they have, and we've seen this with the Cathraxi, we've seen this with their giant servants, they're effective. They have goals. They are not confused by, the infinite possibilities. They also don't really care about infighting as much. They'll do their master's bidding.
And they'll fight each other because their masters have commanded it.
But generally speaking, they don't go out of their way to hurt each other unless it serves the purpose.
Look at the fact that the Kier War was started by Kithrax.
Mm-hmm.
Kithrax was a servant of Loken, who was himself a servant of Yogg-Saron. Yet he worked with a dagger that did not in any way, shape, or form obey Yogg-Saron, and he could channel its power.
Yeah.
And there's also like we know. I don't know how to put this. I don't. Let's just go into like I want to get to
the final point I was going to say is
go for it.
Xal'atath is very dangerous because of this, because it is the closest to us that an old god anything has ever been. If you think about that, it is
absolutely, and we'll be talking about why because that's part of the evolution of this story.
Please go ahead. I just wanted to say that.
No, you're completely correct. I'm going to try to get this broken down so people. At the end of Legion, if you were a Shadow Priest and you had Xal'atath, you had to use Xal'atath to drain the infection from the blade that Sargeras had stabbed Azeroth with to keep the planet from dying.
A bunch of Titan power. Seems a good idea, right?
This broke Xal'atath and the other artifacts used
air quote.
Yeah, air quote broke. It made it so we couldn't use them anymore. There was at least if you were playing at the time, what ended up happening was after you did it, your weapon started having weird fluctuations, which I think is important for the story. It wasn't that the weapon was now broken and useless. It was that the weapon was uncontrollable.
Yes.
Like it had all this Titan power in it and it was uncontrollable. When you next see Xal'atath, the blade has vanished from you, even though you probably still got it in the bank. If you're a Shadow Priest, you're not letting that thing go, but it's gone. Even though you didn't, you just like said, okay, I can't use you anymore. You just hang out here. Nope. Knife noped out. As you're dealing with the Naga in Battle for Azeroth, you start hearing all these reports and you end up essentially making kind of a deal with Xal'atath because you're trying to keep it out of the hand of this obsessed blood elf. Or I don't even know, does she count as a void elf?
She was a void elf, actually.
Okay. Yeah, she's a void elf at this point.
She was a high elf in the process of becoming a void elf when you find her.
Yeah. And she's been trying really hard to get a hold of the knife herself. She wants to do what, Natalie Celine did, what Modgood did, what Xando did, and learn the blade's secrets. As eventually, she ends up dead. And you end up with the knife essentially handing you over to good old-fashioned N'Zoth there. And what's really funny is that in Legion, N'Zoth comes up. Like, Xal'atath talks about N'Zoth.
Yep.
And she does not hold him in high esteem.
Nope.
She essentially says he was the weakest. He's the weakest and the smallest and the most manipulative of its brothers. And yeah. So she makes a deal with N'Zoth. N'Zoth wants you, and she wants out of the knife. Both things that you're like, what? You end up getting, like, if you do this whole quest, you end up with like a hat on, like the multiple eye hat from N'Zoth, and she gets the body of the void elf who's trying to use her. He puts her in that body and keeps the blade. The blade itself he keeps, and it comes up again by the end of Battle for Azeroth when we literally use it to destroy him. Destroy him in big air quotes, but it's useful against the carapace of N'Zoth. The dagger is capable of hurting it because it is an artifact of power that is linked to the old gods. But we still don't know how, by the way. We don't know.
There's speculation, right? So part of the speculation is that it is physically part of an old god, because I believe it's Chronicle. I think it's Chronicle 1, where they talk about weapons crafted from the flesh of an old god were very common, but we still have no idea.
Yeah, but we do know this. Whilst the blade itself was involved in the downfall of N'Zoth and his attempt to conquer Azeroth, Xal'atath, the entity, the mind that did all this, was free and went off on its own. And we don't see her again until the very end. I think it's like the end of I'd say the second tier rating, the underground raid deal. And there's the dungeon where I'm having a horrible time with names today, but the various,
the human ones,
not the human ones, the progenitor, the dragony guys, the bad guys, like the guy Firak and his buddies. I can't remember the one that's the shadow one.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, keep going.
But Yeah, they basically he manages to get an actual essence of Galakrond from the time jaunting bull BS that's going on. He gets his hands on the essence of Galakrond, and then he just nopes out with a figure that is almost certainly Xal'atath.
Well, we know it is now. Like
we know it is now, but at the time, everyone was like, "That was that Xal'atath?" And yeah, he's gone. We have not seen him since, and I'm sure he's popping up in the next expansion. I mean,
I would be surprised if he does not.
Yeah, but he nopes out with Xal'atath, and that's like the first time we've seen her since the deal with N'Zoth. And so we now know that in the War Within, we've already seen a couple of short stories that are like the linking between the War Within and Dragonflight. So we know that she's basically being called like the prophet or the master or something. I don't know. She's now basically she's sort of like in charge of all people who worship the void on Azeroth now. She's gotten herself into that position. And that's kind of interesting because this isn't like the last time we had this kind of thing, we had Deathwing, who was literally cracking from the inside from what the old gods did to corrupt him.
But even he wasn't in charge of everything. He was just a harbinger. He was a servant. And then we also had Shogal, who was driven utterly insane by it. My point is just that this is the first time that this, the Twilight's Hammer and the other Void followers, this is the first time they've had a leader that can plan. Like Xal'atath is a figure who makes plans, and the plans tend to go off. Well, like she totally got N'Zoth to give her freedom, and she used us to do it. Well, hold on a second. I think we're glossing over something here too. How the heck does she travel through time?
That's a good question.
Because
although we know that they can do that, because it's the old gods who trapped Nosdormu in a time vortex and ultimately caused Ronan and Crassus to travel back in time. We know the old gods can do that, even if it's it's weird and not great. Also, we know that this is the one that keeps getting me. We know that N'Zoth was really obsessed with us, and then we know that in Dragonflight we met N'Zoth in the past. It read our minds. I keep coming up. I keep mentioning this because it's important, guys. Like the old gods exist outside of our reality. The cycle does not apply to them. They're not in time the way we are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think Xal'atath having the ability to travel in time is a part of this whole thing. I think it is not necessarily that Xal'atath can travel in time. I think it's more along the lines that Xal'atath can be aware of time in a way. Like if Xal'atath is doing stuff in the past, that doesn't necessarily mean that she physically went there. It means that she just reached out to herself when she was there as a knife and bridged to it. That's one possibility. Like essentially Xal'atath is like an old god and the old gods exist throughout time, not in it. But I think that has a lot to do with the whispers that we keep hearing about, the various prophecies, the 5 torches, all that stuff. I think it comes together in a way that is difficult for us to understand because it doesn't have causality. Things happen before the thing that made them happen. And that's because they're, again, old gods, the 1,000 truths, everything is possible sort of thing.
And we also talked about this too, because one of Matt's favorite quests that we talked about before involving old gods and N'Zoth and things you wear on your head that maybe you shouldn't, or maybe you didn't get rid of when you should have. But like one of the things that happens in Battle for Azeroth, we go back in time.
Mm-hmm.
We experience. No, it's this expansion. Sorry.
Yeah, that's the one we were just talking about.
Yeah, where we experience it. But like again, causality and time traveling is just weird with old gods because they kind of always exist. They're kind of always been a constant, unless you go to a time prior to them being hurled into the universe. Matt's right. It is weird. It is like the worst written episode of Doctor Who, because
or the best, depending on
who you ask. But yeah, it's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Going back for a second to something that's not directly related to Xal'atath, but which I think illustrates a lot of what we're talking about. There's a boss in the Arcatraz who is essentially Harbinger Skyrus, and Harbinger Skyrus much is very much like the Karaji boss, the first boss when you go into AQ40. And Skyrus basically says, we span the universe as numerous as the stars, and no force in existence can make us bend our knee, not even the mighty Legion. And I've always thought about that, because we see a ritual on the shattered remains of Draenor in Outland. There's a ritual to summon what is almost certainly an old god being carried out by the Arakoa. They're trying to call an old god to their world. And there's definitely a connection between the old gods and that corrupting red mist that turns out to be very much a part of the Skyrim. The whole idea of why the Arakoa, some of them can't fly. In fact, by the time of Burning Crusade, almost none of them can fly. Like, I don't think you see a flying one in that expansion. You don't see the flying ones till you go to alternate Draenor. So it's also worth pointing out that when Gul'dan, you see Gul'dan and the things Gul'dan's doing in Warlords of Draenor, one of the things he's doing after he has gotten a bunch of Arakoa to join him is he uses the magic they've showed him to create a being that is simultaneously fell and void at the same time. So what does all that have to do with Xal'atath? On its face, nothing. But it points to how the Void and the Void Lords and the old gods can evolve, like Joe talked about before, about how it's almost like basically, I used to call it, I didn't call it, what Joe called it, the Gron thing. I used to call it the gnome hypothesis, which was that as these, elemental beings evolved from the curse of flesh, they went from big rocky things made out of like stone and metal and so forth to gnomes, who are the smallest and smartest creatures on Azeroth. It's indisputable. Gnomes are smaller and smarter than everybody else. Like, I think the only people they're not smaller than is the Volpera.
And goblins.
Goblins are bigger. They're not a lot bigger, but they're bigger. They're like, a hairbreadth taller, a little bit wider. But goblins also kind of show this process, though, because if you look at their relatives, the hobgoblins, those dudes are like oak trees, and then you got goblins. And it's very similar to the process Joe was talking about, where if you look at like the original Grond on Draenor, and then you see like the Megarons and the Gron and the Ogron, and then finally the ogres, and then after the ogres you get orcs, and these are all like a line of descent down to each other. And the orcs are the smallest and smartest creatures on Draenor, like the native to it anyway. And that's something I find fascinating, because in both cases, it's something created by a Titan that is affected by an old god. And I point that out because that whole presence of the old gods on Draenor, and with their whole deal with the Arakoa and the various empires of the Arakoa, implies that the very process that creates these things is the same. It's old god interference with Titan creations in both cases. So what is Xal'atath then? Xal'atath is an old god something. We don't know if it's a part of an old god or crafted from an old god or the soul of an old god or whatever. We don't know. But it's an old god something that is wandering around in a body that was affected by the Titans, because we know that the Night Elves, who are the ancestors to the High Elves, the Blood Elves, and the Void Elves, were created by trolls who were basically interacted with the Well of Eternity.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is I think that potentially Xal'atath may now be what the Void entities wanted in the material plane, right? Like,
that actually is a good point.
When they hurled pieces of themselves into the real space, I guess I'll just call it, or material plane is really the best analogy I can, but into the universe, they were trying to corrupt, they were trying to engage and consume, but even they couldn't see or perceive how things would go, because it's one in a sea of possibilities. Yeah,
the old gods' biggest problem, the old problem with the Void Lords and the old gods as planners, is that they can't pick anything as the outcome that's going to happen. They know all possibilities, but that means that they have no idea which possibility is going to be the one that comes up.
And we saw that with the creation of the servants of the old gods, that the old gods were already trying to deconstruct how the Titans built what they built, because specifically before they made their own minions, really, they had the elementals enslaved. Then their war came to put everything back, and they started producing armies of, things in their image, whether it was the Cathraxi, or the various entities, the Naraki and the Akir. They were created in a perversion of the process that the Titanforge were being created, right? But that was just step 2, kinda, right? Now you have an entity that has been through all of existence of Azeroth from the Black Empire forward, because we can at least assume that it's been here that long.
Yeah, at least.
And that's really the only clear assumption we can make. But it has been around, it has seen living mortal interactions at a level that the old gods haven't, or that they can't really fathom. And so this is almost like that perfect synthesis. It has the body of a mortal, or one of our particular once formerly Titan forged, because everything comes down from that, or at least if you want to believe.
There's Titan influence in the creation of elves. It's indisputable. It's
indisputable that elves are, and they're probably the closest to Azeroth of any other being. Some argument, but regardless, she's in that body. That was an intentional choice. She has all of that knowledge, all of that power, everything. And I don't think she answers to the old gods anymore.
I don't think she answers to the old gods either, for a very simple reason. I think the old gods are all essentially dead. Now, we know that dying for an old god isn't the same thing as it is for us, but we also know it does change their state. Because when Y'Shaarj dies, Y'Shaarj goes from this one big, powerful, 7-headed monster entity to the Shah and the heart. And did Y'Shaarj still exist at that point? Because it still had the ability to make, the desecrated image of Gorhal. It still had the ability to corrupt and empower servants of young.
It's the way of the Mantid. It still had the power to call the Mantid forward, and
the Shah themselves all existed and had tremendous power.
Yep.
Tremendous power linked directly to the emotional states of the beings around them.
Now, N'Zoth is a question mark, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, because he was blasted with the re-origination beam.
Yeah.
We have no idea what that does to an old god. And
yeah, no clue.
And from the simple fact that we went back in time at this point and have essentially, wearing his hat, tipped him off to everything that's going to happen, and it still happened, it leads to the credence of he wanted it to happen.
Yeah.
Why?
It really does feel like N'Zoth was like, oh, okay, and that's interesting.
But again, I think Xal'atath operates now outside of those bounds. Xal'atath is its own entity of wielding insane power on behalf of the Void. I believe in the next one she's being referred to as the Harbinger, right?
Harbinger, that's what that is. It's the Harbinger. And that's the interesting thing, because we've had a Harbinger before.
Mm-hmm.
But he was beholden to an old god.
Mm-hmm.
Now we don't have an old god. And I think to a certain degree, the old gods may have deliberately taken themselves off the board as part of the plan.
Maybe, but the other thing, too, to keep in mind is Harbinger doesn't just mean a personal herald. It can also be the forerunner of an event.
Yeah, it literally, the Great Fire was the Harbinger to the economic collapse, blah, blah. Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, it's absolutely the case.
For those at home, it could not be the old gods anymore. It might not even be, and this is an interesting thing, is she operating completely independently and not doing the Void's bidding anymore? Is she her own thing? Is she that synthesis?
Here's a question. Does the Void actually have a bidding? Because the Void is nothingness, right?
Supposedly.
The Void sees all possibilities because the Void can't choose any, but she can.
Which I wonder if that makes her the one above all in the Void.
I don't know if it necessarily makes her above the Void so much as it's just the Void is inherently outside of the concepts of existence that Xal'atath has been through. The Void is it's like the Void and the light are both essentially states of being. They're not people, and they don't have minds as such. The light doesn't make a moral judgment about people using it.
Mm-hmm.
The light doesn't care if you're good or bad. It doesn't care It cares about being the light. It cares about illuminating things, revealing things. Like, that's what light does. It's a metaphor as much as it's anything else. And the void is no different. The void is about obscuring, about confusing, about making it hard to determine, about, anything could be out there. Like, what's the saying from Lovecraft? The oldest and strongest emotion is fear, and the oldest and strongest fear is fear of the unknown. That's what the void is all about. The void is about you not knowing. There's no way to know. There's too many possible ways. There's 1,000 truths because anything could be true. And so by becoming an actual physically incarnated being, I think you're right in that she isn't taking orders from anybody because there's nobody to give her orders anymore. Like she didn't take orders she never took orders anyway. If you look at like when she got a wielder, that wielder was only there until they had done what Xal'atath wanted. And then they were gone. The second Xal'atath didn't need them anymore. Boop.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think whether or not it means that she is some kind of like power over the void. I don't think it's necessarily the case that she's power over the void. I think it's the case that anybody could be power over these forces. If Zeliek,
she wields them. She wields them with purpose.
If Xal'atath could tell the light what to do, and he could, and if you don't know who Xal'atath is, he was a Death Knight who was inside the original Nexramas. He was one of the Four Horsemen, and he could command the light despite being an undead, despite being a complete servant of the Lich King. And so I'm going to put it in a slightly different way. I don't know how much time we have left. I think at this point we're getting close.
We're about done. Yeah.
But I'm going to say there's a thread throughout all of World of Warcraft that I don't know has ever really been plucked as well as it should have. But let me put it to you possibly this way. The old gods come to Azeroth. The elementals are already here fighting over the energies that the world
the
Azeroth...
scraps of anima.
Yeah. They're already here. So they're basically a part of a Titan Forge being. They're basically part of a Titan. They're rolling around on the Titan surface. They're fighting for each other for scraps. It's like having eyelash mites, I guess. And they show up and they just boom. They defeat them and enslave them. How? How do you enslave someone in this way so that they have to serve you forever? Well, we have a possible answer to that question, don't we? Because we've been to the Shadowlands. Mm-hmm. And we've seen the Primus's creation, which he created back at the dawn of time, essentially, to keep a being on the power level of a Titan bound up. And it worked so well that when it was used on him, it transformed him into the Rune Carver. So we know that it is an incredibly powerful form of magic called domination magic, which seems very similar to the order magic that the Titans use. And we know that the various demons of the Burning Legion were controlled by summoning rituals that used that power. So we know that it was used throughout there. We know that Gul'dan found a book called The Cipher of Damnation, which he used to create a fell volcano and enslave a Fire Lord on Draenor. That Fire Lord was Siruk the Fire Lord. He was an elemental being. He was an elemental Fire Lord, essentially Draenor's version of Ragnaros.
Mm-hmm.
Ragnaros was summoned to Azeroth by another book. We don't know the name. We don't know if it's the Cipher of Damnation, but we do know that it was
we can make a pretty good guess.
Yeah. So how did Thorassan get his hands on the Cipher of Damnation? And considering his wife was wielding
library of his wife.
Yeah, his wife was wielding a artifact of the void and learning from it, and suddenly he knows how to control Ragnaros well enough to pull him to Azeroth through the barriers the Titans put up to hold him in the Firelands. Because that's the other thing. The Titans created the elemental plane. They had their servants.
Helya did it.
Helya and Raden created it. And they put barriers around it so things couldn't come through it. And the only time we've seen people come through it is when, the mod goods, like the whole Cipher of Damnation thing, and Deathwing punched his way through it. And Deathwing was doing that with the power of the old gods.
And Elementium,
the power
which is
the Titans gave him.
And let's not discount the Elementium, which is based off an alloy that was derived from Azeroth itself. Yeah.
And so there's all these different layers to this, but what it comes down to is this. I believe that Xal'atath is basically complete rejection of domination magic.
Mm-hmm.
She's like the void's inability to be dominated. You can't dominate the void. You can't control the void. And therefore, she doesn't control the void because she doesn't have to. The void and her are basically simpatico. The void wants nothingness, it wants potential, it wants possibility. She wants to break every stricture. And so therefore it's a perfect team up. It's not even a question of team up. It's like being a physicist, you can be said to be working alongside the natural forces. If you build a windmill, you're not enslaving the wind. The wind is just doing what wind does, and you've built something that takes advantage of that. She is literally taking advantage. And I think that's because she has moved through all the stages Joe mentioned and has gone from incohate force of chaos to absolutely cohate force of chaos. She is a force of chaos in a humanoid body with a brain and a mind. And that makes her way more dangerous than a lot of the other ones we faced because they couldn't really respond to things. They couldn't plan. Like, look at the idea of N'Zoth's plans. Look at what they were. Look at what they are. But Xal'atath can plan. And so I think it's really interesting to watch this. I have to admit that a lot of that comes from Joe, man, because I'm just sitting here listening to him and going, oh, wait a minute, he's right. What about this? So, yeah, and really we need to talk more about domination magic at some point because seriously, there's a thread there, man.
We have many more shows coming, and if you are interested in hearing us talk about domination magic, you can go ahead and let us know, because Blizzard Watch is made possible due to the generous contributions at patreon.com/BlizzardWatch. Your continued support means that this podcast sighting community is able to thrive and grow. Blizzard Watch supporters enjoy exclusive benefits like early access to the podcast, a better chance at having your question answered on our podcast with a queue, and an ads-free site experience. Again, comments or questions, send those into podcast@blizzardwatch.com. If that is a question or topic, please specify the spelling or the pronunciation of your name. If you want to hit us up on Discord, you can hit us up on the Q and Podcast Questions channel. And if you are a Patreon subscriber, you can go to the Patreon Q and Podcast channel, where we will tend to look first. With that, folks, we'll see you next week.